Let's talk about public-private partnerships. How do you think they can help to scale up large projects across the continent?
Well, first is that Africa has an infrastructure financing gap of anything between $68 billion and $108 billion a year. So, in trying to build your ports, your rail, your airports, your digital infrastructure, water and sanitation, and so on, that's a lot of money. And so, but in Africa, you see, a lot of the infrastructure is actually built by governments. And in a situation where you have rising debt by many of the countries, right? That debt distress means that governments have to find a better way of financing infrastructure rather than put all the pressure on their own shoulders. And the way to do that is public-private partnerships. Get the private sector into energy. Make sure that the environment for energy is such that the cost that people pay, the tariff that they pay for energy is cost reflective. So it makes it actually profitable for private investors to go into that particular space. You take a look, for example, at the amount of resources that we need. Okay, if you look at Africa today in terms of the amount of financing that's available, resources under management, assets under management by institutional investors. I'm talking about pension funds, I'm talking about insurance companies and sovereign wealth funds. It's about $2.3 trillion. Now, if they just simply make infrastructure an asset class in which they can invest those funds, you can imagine how much we can quickly close that gap. And I think the third one also is to have um, public-private partnership frameworks that actually allow you to develop the projects, to make them bankable, and then to finance them, and to make sure that you have stable policy environments that can undergird private sector participation in infrastructure. So, as an African Development Bank, we're asking ourselves the question for everything we want to do on infrastructure. Think infrastructure, but ask yourself question first: what can be done with the private sector? Because the private sector is the engine of growth, and we can't just simply keep having only governments doing infrastructure.
Capital markets play a critical role in mobilizing investment in Africa, but they encounter some challenges. What are some of these challenges and what's the way forward?
Well, for you to have capital markets that work, you must be able to mobilize savings. And so the first thing is to make sure that we have a savings rate that actually goes up so we can actually have pools of capital that we can use. And secondly is to make sure that our capital markets are very well regulated. And so you can also support companies, a lot more companies to list on these capital markets. And most of these companies don't have to be the big companies. Have small cap companies that can be listed on the capital markets. And I think that also we need to make sure that the capital markets also support allocation of efficient allocation of capital towards critical areas like infrastructure, energy, and so on. Most of the financing that needs to go to infrastructure in Africa is borrowed from external financing. But as you know, there's a foreign exchange component to that you are getting the streams of income or revenue in local currency, and then you're borrowing in expensive in foreign currencies. So there's a gap in that. And so one of the things I think we need to do better is to make sure that we are lending in local currencies. And at the African Development Bank, we have an increasingly a large portfolio of lending in local currency so that people can avoid the forex risks that goes with borrowing in expensive foreign currency, but your revenue streams are in local currencies.
Mr. Adesina, as the president of the Africa Development Bank Group, can you share with us the future plans and priorities of these institutions for fostering inclusive growth and development in Africa?
Well, I mean, Africa certainly, as I said to you, has to grow in a way that is able to create a lot of jobs for its young people. The young people we have in Africa, that's Africa's biggest asset. But if we don't actually invest in that very well, that will actually undermine our economic, political, and social stability as a continent. And therefore, the young people always say the youth are the future of Africa. I don't believe that. The youth are the present of Africa. We have to start investing in them in skills via education, and also in particular putting our resources behind them. And that's why the African Development Bank, we're supporting now establishing what's called the Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Banks. These are new financial institutions. All they are going to do is simply build financial ecosystems around our young people, whether they're in the creative industry, whether they're in the digital industry, whether in the food and agricultural industry, whether they are in the fintech industry. We want to make sure that they have the resources they need. I always, one of the things that makes me distressed sometimes is when I look at the television and I see African young people get on rickety boats and they go to as the Mediterranean, trying to go to Europe. I don't believe that the future of Africa is utilized in Europe. I don't believe it lies in the United States. I don't believe it lies in Asia or Latin America. It must lie in Africa growing well, but putting his resources behind his young people to become the workforce of the world. And so that's why we are doing this Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Bank. So investing in the youth is in the future. The other part of it is, um, Africa, it, when we had the structural adjustment in Africa, guess who was keeping Africa afloat? It was the women that were actually doing businesses, the market women in Africa. Africa has very resilient women. And so, as president of the African Development Bank, I determined that, look, we have to put financial resources behind our women. Because if you want to have inclusive growth, you have to have the young people, you have to have the women. And that's why we launched what's called the Affirmative Finance Action for Women, or AFAWA, now to mobilize $5 billion and provide that to businesses of women. And we're doing great. In the last 3 years, we've been able to work with more than almost 90 financial institutions in more than 15 countries and deployed $1.2 billion of support to businesses of women. And by the end of this year, we will have done $1.5 billion. So I think there is no future for Africa without its youth and without its women. And the other thing that I would say to have inclusive growth in the future for Africa is the rural areas. You see, I went to school in a rural area, and I know that in rural areas, the livelihoods of rural communities depends on agriculture. But the poverty levels are still very high in our rural areas. And the reason is because the source of their income, which is agriculture, is still seen like a subsistence sector, you know. And it's not just about eating food today. Yeah. You got to be able to have an agriculture sector more productive, more efficient. That's a wealth creating sector that's going to lift up the living standards of the people in the rural areas and reduce the inequality between the urban areas and the rural areas. And to tackle that, that's why the African Development Bank is investing heavily in agriculture. We've invested more than $12 billion in agriculture so far. If you take, for example, now we are investing in what we call special agro-industrial processing zones, where we put in about $1.5 billion to do 25 of them in 11 countries. And what are these zones? They're just big economic zones where you put infrastructure, water, roads, logistics, processing facilities, so that private enterprises, food processors can come there. So you produce a tomatoes, for example, and it gets rotten. Fruits and vegetables get rotten. Or you produce cocoa, and you're selling cocoa while others are making money selling chocolates, right? You have coffee beans, others are making brewed coffee, but you're selling coffee beans, so you're going to be poor. And so we want to have these special agro-industrial processing zones as zones where you add value to everything that Africa produces in agriculture in particular. And as that happens, guess what? You will turn your cotton into textile and garment. You will turn your cocoa beans into chocolates. You will turn your coffee into brewed coffee, right? And you will be able to make more money out of everything that we produce, and the living standards will rise. So the three things in the future, very, very important are those things. But finally, to have a really balanced growth in the future, we have to build our cities better. As a person, when I go around Africa, and I see a lot of cities. The cities are critical for economic growth, but our cities are growing in a very disorganized manner, in particular with our water, with our sanitation, with our affordable housing, and without energy. And you want to have livable cities. But when I see slums, And people get comfortable with slums. I am not comfortable with slums. And when people tell me, oh, we just want to upgrade the slums, my response is there are no five-star slums. There's no slum that's a five-star slum. A slum is a slum. And that's why at this Africa Investment Forum just yesterday, we had a 3-hour session with governors and with mayors of cities to find out how we can support the subnationals to have access to the resources to plan urbanization better, to make sure that we can have water and sanitation, to be able to have the critical transport infrastructure, to make our cities engines of growth. You cannot have significant economic growth unless you actually grow your cities and make the per capita income rise through creating industrial jobs in your cities. So those are the critical areas for me. When you look at the youth, when you look at the women, when you look at balancing growth so that the rural areas become new zones of economic prosperity, not zones of economic misery. And when you have a balanced growth system that allows our cities to become exciting cities that are able to, you can live there, where you can make a lot of money living there. That's the future that I see.
Thank you for honoring our invitation.
Thank you very much, Ruth. It's good to see you.
Thank you, dear viewers, for watching. Stay tuned for more programs on Africa 24.